I didn't know how long I'd been unconscious, but when I opened my eyes, the sterile white walls of the hospital room greeted me like a cold slap to the face. I blinked, trying to adjust, and felt the overwhelming weight of something missing, like I had forgotten something important. A dull ache throbbed in my head as I tried to piece together what had happened. My surroundings felt alien, sharp, and bright, the steady beep of monitors filling the room, but something wasn't right. I instinctively reached up to touch my neck, only to feel a sudden hollow emptiness where something precious should have been. My fingers brushed over smooth skin, but my family's diamond, my grandmother's heirloom, the one that had been passed down through generations, was gone. My heart sank. A pang of panic twisted in my chest as my fingers searched again. This time more frantically. There was nothing. The diamond had been with me for as long as I could remember, the one piece of jewelry I'd never take off. It was more than just an object. It was a symbol of my family, my lineage, and something I'd worked hard to protect and cherish. It was my constant reminder of my mother and my grandmother, of everything they had sacrificed, and of everything I was supposed to uphold. I sat up quickly, the motion making my head spin, and I immediately regretted it. My vision blurred, but I steadied myself, ignoring the discomfort. I needed to figure out what had happened. How had I ended up here? What was I missing? That's when it hit me, Greg, my ex-husband, the man who had always been good at convincing me that he had my best interests at heart, despite all the years of emotional manipulation and control. I tried to push the thought away. No, not Greg. He wouldn't dare. But deep down, a nagging feeling refused to leave. It was as though I could feel him lurking in the shadows of my memories, his presence always just beneath the surface. I had no proof. Not yet. But as I looked around the room again, the disorientation started to fade, and something deep inside told me this wasn't just some random robbery. This was personal. This was deliberate. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, replaying the events in my mind. I had been in that accident. The car had skidded out of control, and I remembered the last thing I saw before everything went dark. My car crashing into the guardrail, the metal screeching as it twisted, and then nothing. It was all a blur, like a bad dream that wouldn't let go. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Greg had been the one to drive me to that hospital. He had been the one to make all the decisions while I lay unconscious. I tried to push back against the flood of thoughts, but the more I thought about it, the more my gut twisted. I remembered how Greg had insisted on being the one to manage everything for me after the accident, how he'd barged into my life, taking control of everything from my finances to my recovery. He'd always been like that, swooping in to help whenever things went wrong. But with every helpful gesture came a hidden agenda, an unspoken control that he wielded like a weapon. Greg had always known how much that diamond meant to me. Hell, he had always known how much I cared about everything my family had worked for, and that diamond was the centerpiece of that legacy. He knew how to manipulate me, how to make me feel guilty when I stood my ground, and how to make me feel like I owed him. And now, that diamond, that piece of our history, was gone. It was in that moment of realization that I knew. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't an accident. Greg had taken it. But why? Why would he steal from me when I was already vulnerable, when I couldn't defend myself? I lay back in the bed, feeling a mix of disbelief and fury rise up in me. The betrayal stung worse than I could have imagined. It wasn't just the diamond. It wasn't just about the theft. It was about everything he had taken from me, from my dignity to my sense of self. He had taken advantage of my weakest moment, and in doing so, had shown me exactly who he was. I wanted to scream. I wanted to lash out. But I couldn't. Not yet. I had to be calm. I had to think clearly. This wasn't just about getting the diamond back. It was about reclaiming my life and my autonomy. It was about standing up to him in a way I never had before. But first, I needed answers. I needed to confirm my suspicions. I had no evidence, no witnesses, just the feeling in the pit of my stomach that told me this wasn't just some random incident. This was something Greg had orchestrated. The theft was just the tip of the iceberg, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. As I lay there, lost in thought, the door to my room creaked open, and a nurse stepped in. Her kind face was a welcome sight, but it didn't stop the storm of anger that raged inside me. I had to get out of this hospital. I had to take back control, and I had to make Greg pay for what he had done. But that would come later. First, I needed to recover. I needed to regain my strength. And I needed to be ready for the fight that was about to come. Because I wasn't going to let him get away with it. The days after waking up from the coma felt like I was floating in a fog. My body was still weak, my mind struggling to keep up with the sudden, overwhelming realization that I was alone, vulnerable, and betrayed in ways I couldn't even begin to fathom. But it wasn't just the physical healing that consumed me. It was the gnawing, ever-present feeling that something was wrong, something deeper than just my accident. As I tried to wrap my head around the reality of being in a hospital, I started asking questions. I needed to understand why I was here, what had happened, and where my life had gone in the weeks I'd been unconscious. My memory was still fragmented, bits and pieces here and there, but nothing solid enough to make sense of it all. It was a nurse who first gave me the hardest dose of reality. She casually mentioned how Greg, my ex-husband, had been the one to manage all my affairs while I was in the hospital. Everything from finances to decisions about my care. I stared at her, not quite comprehending what she was saying. Greg? The same Greg who had walked out on me years ago, leaving me to pick up the pieces. Why would he be involved now? But the more I thought about it, the more my stomach churned. I had barely seen him since our divorce. His calls had dwindled to nothing, and any interactions we did have were cold and distant. But apparently, for some reason, he had taken it upon himself to oversee my recovery, something I hadn't asked for, something I never would have agreed to if I had been in my right mind. I had been too vulnerable, too weak to see the signs of manipulation before, but now it was as if a veil had lifted. I had never truly understood just how deeply his control ran, how much he'd taken from me even before the diamond disappeared. That evening, after a long, draining conversation with my lawyer, I was handed the police report. The words on the page were blurry at first, my hands shaking as I tried to focus. My lawyer had suggested I file a report about the diamond, about what had been stolen from me, but I wasn't prepared for what I was about to read. My hands trembled as I flipped through the report, my eyes scanning the words, each one hitting harder than the last. My heart skipped a beat when I saw it. Greg had been the one to move my valuables out of the house during my hospital stay. He had taken control of everything, and that diamond, it wasn't just missing, it was gone. My grandmother's diamond, the one thing I had promised to protect, was now in the hands of the man who once swore to love me. But the shock didn't end there. The police report detailed the surveillance footage from my home security cameras. A chilling, icy feeling washed over me as I read the description of Greg entering the house after I'd been admitted to the hospital. The footage showed him unlocking the safe, his hands moving with cold efficiency as he took the diamond. The report said it with such stark clarity. Greg had taken the family diamond. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. I wasn't just a victim of a random theft. I was the victim of a betrayal so profound that I couldn't wrap my mind around it. How could the man who had once promised to care for me, the man I had loved, do something so low, so heartless? The diamond wasn't just an object. It was a piece of my heritage, a link to my family's past that I had treasured for years. And now it was gone, in the hands of the very person who had sworn to honor it. I could hardly breathe as I continued reading. Greg hadn't just taken the diamond either. The report detailed how he had emptied my accounts, manipulated my credit cards, and used my finances for his own gain. He had even made large transfers, moving money around as if it were his to control. It wasn't just the diamond. It wasn't just the physical objects. It was everything I had worked for, everything I had built, gone in an instant, while I lay in a hospital bed, unconscious, completely unaware. The finality of it all settled in like a weight in my chest. I felt the cold sting of betrayal like I never had before. Greg hadn't just stolen from me. He had taken control of my life. He had exploited my vulnerability and treated me like nothing more than a pawn in his game. He hadn't even had the decency to respect me enough to leave me with something of value, something to hold on to, something that could remind me of the woman I once was. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the report still in my hands, my mind racing. How had I been so blind? How had I allowed him to manipulate me for so long? I had always known there was something off about Greg, some underlying darkness I couldn't quite understand. But I never thought he would go this far. As the realization sank in, something inside me shifted. The shock of the betrayal was overwhelming, yes, but it also sparked a fire deep within me. I wasn't just going to sit back and let this happen. I wasn't going to let him get away with this, take my diamond, take my money, and take my dignity, all while I was powerless to stop him. This was not going to be the end of my story. It was just the beginning. The rage inside me was raw, but it was mixed with something else, something stronger. It was the desire for justice, for reclaiming what was mine. I wasn't going to let Greg destroy me or my family's legacy without a fight. The moment of realization had come, and now there was no turning back. After filing the police report, I was left with nothing but a growing sense of unease and anger. I knew deep down that something wasn't right, but nothing could have prepared me for the truth that was about to come to light. The days following my initial report were long, filled with endless phone calls with my lawyer, hospital visits, and trying to piece together the fragments of my life that Greg had so carelessly shattered. But it wasn't until the police officer showed up at my doorstep that the full extent of his betrayal became undeniable. It was a cold, dreary afternoon when the officer arrived. His face was serious, but he was polite. Too polite, perhaps. He handed me a plain manila envelope without saying much, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I could already feel the weight of what was inside, but I didn't dare open it until I was sitting down, away from the prying eyes of my neighbors. I didn't want to face the truth. Not yet. But there was no avoiding it. I ripped the envelope open with shaking hands, pulling out a stack of photos and a DVD. The officer, still standing at the door, gave me a brief explanation. "We've recovered some footage from your security system. This is from the day after you were admitted to the hospital." My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the photos first. There, in grainy black and white, was Greg, his face frozen in a look of cold indifference. He was standing in front of the safe in my home, the very safe that had held my family's heirlooms for generations. I could feel my stomach turn as I recognized the exact moment the betrayal unfolded. He was taking the diamond. The photos were crystal clear, each one showing Greg's steady hands as he worked the combination lock, opening the safe. The diamond I had once worn with such pride, the diamond that had belonged to my grandmother and great-grandmother before her, was now being lifted from its velvet case by the very man who had once promised to take care of me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run out of the house and confront him right there, but the reality of the situation kept me frozen. The diamond, the one thing that had been passed down from generation to generation, was now in his hands, and there was no denying it. He had taken it. But the photos were only part of it. There, nestled among the papers, was the DVD. I didn't need to be told what it was. I knew. This was the footage that would show Greg in action, caught red-handed. I slid the DVD into my player, holding my breath as the screen flickered to life. The footage was shaky at first, but it quickly stabilized. There, in full color, was Greg walking through the front door of my house, entering the living room with the air of someone who belonged. He moved toward the safe with deliberate steps, his face grim and focused. I watched, unable to look away, as Greg approached the safe. He didn't hesitate. His movements were confident, practiced even. He had clearly been here before. I could see him expertly turning the dial, entering the combination with a familiarity that sent chills down my spine. And then he opened the safe. I felt my chest tighten as I saw him remove the velvet box that held the diamond. He didn't even pause to admire it. He just took it, closed the safe, and left as quickly as he came. The entire thing had taken no more than 5 minutes, but those 5 minutes felt like an eternity to me. In those moments, I watched my trust, my family's legacy, my history, all disappear into the hands of someone who had once been my partner. The footage ended, and I was left staring at the screen in disbelief. My mind raced, trying to process what I had just seen. It wasn't just the theft, it was the coldness with which he had done it. He hadn't thought twice. He hadn't hesitated. Greg had taken the diamond without a second thought, and I was left with nothing but a broken heart and the sickening realization that everything I had worked for, everything I had trusted, had been violated. I didn't know what to do next. I felt like I was suffocating, the walls of my own home closing in on me. But one thing was clear. I had been betrayed in the worst way possible. And now I had proof. The police officer had no words to offer, no sympathy for the pain I was going through. But as he turned to leave, he gave me a final piece of advice. This footage is all we need. We'll take it from here. We'll get him, Emily. We'll get your diamond back. I nodded numbly, though I didn't feel reassured. I just felt empty. The diamond was gone. My trust was gone. And now, all that was left was a fight. A fight for justice. For the past that Greg had stolen from me. I had no idea what was coming next. But one thing was certain. I was going to make sure Greg paid for what he had done. I wasn't going to let him get away with this, no matter what it took. The day I had been dreading finally arrived. I had spent weeks thinking about it, about the confrontation that I knew had to happen, even though I didn't feel ready. The shock of seeing the footage of Greg stealing my family's diamond was still fresh in my mind, gnawing at me every single day. But I couldn't let that stop me. I couldn't run from it anymore. It was time to face him. My lawyer had arranged the meeting in his office, a neutral place. He promised to be there to keep things civil, but honestly, I wasn't sure if that would even matter. I was already so angry, so hurt, that I didn't know if I could stay composed for long. But I had to try. This was my moment. I was going to confront him. Not as the wife he had once manipulated, but as the woman who was taking back control of her life. When I walked into the office, Greg was already sitting at the table, looking like he hadn't lost a moment's sleep over what he had done. He sat with his arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips, as if he still thought he had the upper hand. It made my blood boil. There he was, the man who had broken me, the man who had stolen from me when I was at my lowest. He didn't even look the slightest bit guilty. If anything, he looked smug. Emily, Greg greeted me with a casual nod, like this was just another normal day in the life of two exes meeting for a chat. His voice sounded so calm, so collected, that it was almost as if nothing had changed. I could feel the tension building in my chest. The anger I had been holding in for weeks bubbled to the surface, threatening to spill over. But I had to stay calm. I had to stay focused. I glanced at my lawyer, who gave me a reassuring look. "Go ahead, Emily," he said softly. "We're here to hear what Greg has to say." I turned back to Greg, my eyes narrowing. "You know why we're here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You stole from me, from my family. You stole my diamond." Greg shrugged, a nonchalant gesture that made me want to scream. "I didn't steal it, Em," he said, with a shrug that seemed too practiced, too rehearsed. "I just borrowed it. It wasn't a big deal." "Borrowed?" I repeated, my voice rising despite myself. "You stole it. You took something that wasn't yours, something that's been passed down for generations in my family. You took something that meant more to me than anything else. I could feel the heat of my anger flush through me, but I tried to focus on the words, the facts. I had the footage. I had the proof. He couldn't talk his way out of this. Greg leaned forward, his face suddenly taking on a more serious tone, though I could still see the arrogance behind his eyes. "Look, Emily, you've always been so attached to that stupid diamond," he said, his voice condescending. "It's just a piece of jewelry. It's not worth ruining everything over." That was it, the final straw. I could feel my blood pressure rising as I glared at him across the table. "It's not just a piece of jewelry, Greg," I spat. "It's a symbol of my family's history. You don't get to decide what's worth it and what isn't. You had no right to take it. You had no right to go into my house, open the safe, and steal from me like that." Greg didn't flinch. He just leaned back in his chair, the smug look still on his face. "It's just a diamond, Emily," he repeated, as if repeating it enough times would somehow make it true. "You're making this into a bigger deal than it is. And honestly, I don't get why you're so upset. You should be thankful. You were in a coma, for God's sake. You were lucky to be alive, and I was doing you a favor by borrowing it. You didn't need that burden." I could feel the tears stinging the back of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I wasn't going to cry over him. Not anymore. Not after everything he had done. "You're unbelievable," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but filled with all the fury I had been holding back. "I gave you everything, Greg. I gave you my trust, my love, my support, and you repay me by taking from me when I'm at my most vulnerable?" Greg didn't respond immediately. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Finally, he leaned forward again, his eyes hardening. "Look, Emily, I'm sorry you feel that way," he said, his voice low and defensive now. "But I'm not going to apologize for what I did. It's not like you needed the diamond anyway. And let's be honest, you've been so wrapped up in your own little world, always looking for ways to stay in control. Maybe it's time you let go of things that don't really matter." I felt a wave of disgust wash over me. He didn't even have the decency to apologize. He didn't even feel bad about what he had done. He was justifying it. He was minimizing it. He was trying to make me feel crazy for being upset. But I wasn't crazy. I wasn't wrong. And I wasn't going to back down. "I want my diamond back," I said, my voice cold, steady. "And I want you to know that I'm not going to let you get away with this. You're going to pay for what you did, Greg. You took something irreplaceable from me, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." Greg didn't respond right away, but I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He knew this wasn't something I was going to let slide. He knew I had the evidence, and he knew that this time I wasn't the same woman he had once controlled. I was done being passive. I was done being the victim. The meeting ended there, with no apology, no remorse from Greg. Just empty words and a cold stare. But I walked out of that office stronger than I had been when I walked in. I was taking control of my own life now. And Greg? He was going to regret crossing me. The days following that confrontation were some of the hardest of my life. As much as I had vowed to reclaim my life and fight back, it still felt like a massive weight was pressing down on me. The betrayal by Greg stung deeper than I could have ever anticipated. It wasn't just the diamond. It was everything, the years I had spent with him, the trust I had given him. The moments I had shared with him thinking that he was someone I could rely on. That was gone now, shattered. And in its place, a deep, aching sense of loss and anger that I couldn't shake. But I knew one thing. I couldn't stay stuck in the past. I had spent too much time letting Greg control my life, my finances, my emotions, my sense of self. Now, it was time for me to step up, take control, and rebuild everything from the ground up. And that wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. I started by going through the mess Greg had left behind in my house. When he had moved me into the hospital after the accident, he had made sure to get rid of anything that could tie him to any wrongdoings. He had moved my belongings out of their places, taken over the house, and started making decisions about what was best for me. Or so he said. It was clear that he had been slowly orchestrating his takeover of my life for months, if not years. But now that I was awake and aware, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The first thing I did was go through my bank accounts. I had always been someone who trusted Greg when it came to finances. He handled most of our bills and investments, while I focused on my career and other responsibilities. It was something I never thought twice about. But now, looking through everything, I saw the red flags. Large transfers, mysterious withdrawals. I realized how much control he had exerted over my life, while I had been unaware. It made my stomach churn, but it also lit a fire in me that I hadn't felt in years. I started closing joint accounts. I changed the passwords to everything: bank accounts, credit cards, and even social media. I canceled the credit cards that had Greg's name on them, ones he'd used to make unauthorized purchases when I was out of it. The amount of damage he'd done wasn't small, but I had to start somewhere. Each action I took felt like I was tearing down the walls he had built around me. It wasn't just about the money. It was about taking back the pieces of myself that I had handed over to him without even realizing it. Next, I went through my personal things, my jewelry, my clothes, and even my memories of us. I couldn't avoid it any longer. The diamond was gone, and I couldn't just sit and mourn over something that had been taken from me. I had to let it go, even though it felt like losing a part of my own identity. But the more I focused on the task at hand, the more I realized that what I had with Greg was never really mine to begin with. It was a lie I had been living in, and now I was freeing myself from it. Packing up my things wasn't easy. I felt a deep pang each time I touched something that reminded me of him. Our wedding photos, the little trinkets he had bought me over the years, the items I thought would forever hold sentimental value. I had to decide what I wanted to keep and what I was finally ready to let go of. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was doing something for me. Not for him, not for anyone else. I took a moment to sit down on the couch, surrounded by boxes, and allowed myself a small breather. The weight of the decision to move forward, to close that chapter of my life, felt both liberating and overwhelming. But then, something inside me clicked. I was no longer a victim of Greg's manipulation. I was no longer the woman who had been controlled by his actions. I was stronger now. I had fought for my life, and I was finally taking it back. In the following days, I set new goals for myself. I enrolled in a financial management course. I started taking better care of my health. I made a promise to myself that I would never let anyone, especially not Greg, make me feel small or powerless again. I took up a new hobby that I had always wanted to try, but had never had the courage to pursue. It was something simple, painting, but it gave me a sense of joy I hadn't felt in a long time. As the weeks went by, I began to rebuild my life from scratch, but this time, I wasn't doing it for anyone else. I was doing it for me. I began to reconnect with old friends who had always supported me, people I had distanced myself from because I had been so caught up in my relationship with Greg. I spent more time with family, real family, who loved me for who I was, not for what I could give them. The diamond, the object that had been at the center of this entire ordeal, was still gone. But I had learned something far more valuable in its absence. I was capable of rebuilding my life on my own terms. The betrayal that had once left me feeling helpless had now become the fuel for my transformation. Greg may have taken the diamond, but he couldn't take my strength, my determination, or my will to thrive. I was moving forward, and I was doing it with confidence. I was no longer the woman who had been deceived. I was the woman who was taking control, no matter what. And that felt better than anything else ever could. The months after I confronted Greg and discovered the depths of his betrayal were long and filled with emotional turmoil, but I knew one thing for certain. I was done being a passive participant in my own life. I wasn't going to let him get away with stealing my family's legacy, with violating my trust in such a brutal, callous way. As soon as I realized the full extent of what he had done, I knew that taking legal action wasn't just about recovering the diamond. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my future. I wasn't alone in this. I reached out to a lawyer, someone I had known through business circles, and I explained my situation in great detail. He listened attentively, his face serious, but I could tell that he was already thinking through the case, weighing my options. I felt a sense of relief just sitting there, talking to someone who understood the seriousness of what had happened. It was like a burden had been lifted, just by making the decision to fight back. My lawyer, Thomas, didn't sugarcoat anything. He told me this would be a battle, and it could get ugly. Greg had a lot of power, and he would fight tooth and nail to avoid facing consequences. But I didn't care. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I had spent too many years tiptoeing around his needs, around his manipulations. Now, it was my turn to take charge. We started by gathering every piece of evidence we could find. Surveillance footage from my security cameras showed Greg entering my house in the middle of the night, taking the diamond out of its safe. It was almost surreal to see it all on the screen, to watch the man I had once trusted walking away with the very thing I had inherited from my grandmother. That video alone was enough to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but we didn't stop there. We also dug into Greg's financial records. My lawyer was able to uncover a trail of transactions that had been linked to the sale of expensive items, many of which had come from my home. Greg had attempted to cover his tracks by transferring the diamond and other valuables into accounts under fake names. But it was no match for Thomas's thoroughness. Every move Greg made, every attempt to conceal his actions, was now laid out in front of us like a map of his deceit. The hardest part was facing the emotional toll this entire process was taking. I had spent so much of my life trying to avoid conflict, trying to keep things smooth and peaceful. But this was different. Greg had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and I wasn't about to let him walk away scot-free. But the emotional strain wasn't easy to bear. Each time I saw the evidence against him, each time I had to recount the details of our marriage and his manipulation, I felt like I was opening old wounds. It was painful to relive everything, but it was also empowering. Each step we took brought me closer to the truth, and closer to the justice I so desperately needed. Thomas prepared the lawsuit carefully, taking everything into account. The theft of the diamond, the fraud, the emotional distress Greg had caused, and the way he had taken advantage of my vulnerability while I was unconscious and unaware of what was happening around me. I wasn't just suing him for the diamond. I was suing him for everything he had stolen from me over the years of trust, of love, of the life we had shared that was now exposed for the lie it had been. The moment I signed the papers, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a personal one. I had taken the first step toward holding Greg accountable. I was no longer the woman who had been blindsided by his betrayal. I was the woman who was fighting back, who was standing up for what was rightfully hers. I won't pretend that the process was easy. It was emotionally exhausting. And there were days when I doubted myself. Days when I thought about how much easier it would be to just walk away, to let it all go and move on. But I couldn't do that. Not anymore. I had to see this through. It wasn't just about getting the diamond back. It was about making sure Greg knew that he couldn't get away with this. The legal battle was long, filled with delays and twists I hadn't expected. But I refused to back down. Every time I walked into that courthouse, every time I met with Thomas, I knew I was doing the right thing. And eventually, the case began to turn in my favor. It was clear that Greg had underestimated me. He thought I would roll over, that I wouldn't fight for myself. But I wasn't the same woman I had been when we were married. I had grown stronger, more resolute, and I was ready to fight until the very end. The day I officially filed the lawsuit, I felt like I was taking control of my own life again. I wasn't some victim, some helpless woman who had been taken advantage of. I was a force to be reckoned with, and Greg was about to learn that the hard way. As much as the process tested me, I knew it was the right thing to do. For my family's legacy, for my own peace of mind, and for the future I wanted to build. One where I was no longer hiding from the truth, but standing tall in the face of it. The legal process had begun, but the emotional weight of what Greg had done continued to haunt me. I had spent days and nights consumed by the details of the case, gathering evidence, speaking with my lawyer, reliving the heartbreak of discovering his betrayal. But no matter how many steps I took toward justice, the ache in my chest was still there. It was like a persistent, gnawing pain that I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. I remember one particular afternoon, sitting alone in a park. The sun was shining, but I felt cold. I was surrounded by empty benches, each one a reminder of the isolation I now felt. I had so many friends who supported me, but no one could truly understand the depth of the betrayal I was experiencing. Everyone wanted to help, to make things better, but no one could erase the gut-wrenching feeling of being lied to by someone I had loved for years. The thoughts would come unbidden, memories of Greg and I, before everything changed. When we were happy, when I thought he was the one I could trust with my life, my future, and even my family's most precious heirloom. I had poured my heart and soul into our marriage, and even after the divorce, I had still believed that there was some semblance of decency in him. But now, looking back, I could see how foolish I had been. How easily he had manipulated me. How he had quietly worn down my trust until there was nothing left but an empty shell of a person who had no qualms about stealing from me when I was at my lowest. That day in the park, I thought about everything I had invested in him, the love, the sacrifice, the trust. All of it had been for nothing. Greg had walked out of my life, but I had never imagined that he would return and take something so deeply personal from me. I had thought that after everything we went through together, there was no way he could hurt me again. But I was wrong. And now, every time I closed my eyes, I couldn't escape the vision of him walking out of my home with my family's diamond, as if it were just another object to him. The emotional toll was more than I had expected. There were nights I cried in my bed, not just for the diamond, but for the years I had spent with him, years that now felt like they had been a lie. I felt betrayed on every level, not just by him, but by my own inability to see who he really was. How could I have been so blind? How could I have given him everything, only to have him use that trust against me? As the trial approached, I found myself questioning everything. Was I strong enough to face him in court? Was I truly prepared to see this through, knowing how emotionally exhausting it would be? My lawyer kept telling me to stay focused on the bigger picture, getting the diamond back and ensuring that Greg faced the consequences of his actions. But there were moments, especially in the silence of my apartment, when the weight of it all felt unbearable. I spent time reflecting on the woman I had become throughout this ordeal. At first, I had been angry, driven by the need for revenge. But over time, I began to realize that this wasn't about Greg anymore. This was about me reclaiming my peace of mind, my trust in myself, and my ability to move forward. Yes, I had been wronged. Yes, Greg had stolen from me in the worst way possible. But the more I allowed myself to sit in that pain, the less I was allowing myself to heal. I took long walks, trying to clear my head, but the emptiness was always there, lurking in the background. The betrayal had left a scar, and while I knew that scars fade with time, it was hard to imagine a day when this pain wouldn't feel so raw. There were days when I felt like I was drowning in my own emotions, grief, anger, disbelief. But those were the days when I knew I had to keep going, because the only way to truly heal was to face the pain head on. I leaned on my friends during these dark moments. They reminded me of my strength, of how far I had come even when I didn't feel like I was making progress. They were my lifeline. Without them, I might have crumbled under the weight of it all. But their support, their words of encouragement, kept me going. They didn't try to fix me. They just reminded me that I wasn't alone. The emotional toll didn't lessen, but I started to learn how to live with it. Every day, I took one step forward. Even when it felt like the world was too heavy to bear, I found solace in the small victories, getting out of bed, making progress in the case, finding moments of peace, even if they were fleeting. In the end, I realized that healing wasn't a linear process. It wasn't about waking up one day and suddenly feeling okay. It was about accepting the pain, understanding that it was a part of my journey, and knowing that with time, I would be able to move beyond it. The betrayal would always be a part of my story, but it would no longer define me. I would define myself, and that thought gave me the strength to keep going, one day at a time. The day of the trial had finally arrived. I had spent months preparing for this moment, months of reliving the pain, of gathering evidence, of facing the reality that I was about to go head-to-head with the man I had once loved. The courtroom was cold, the walls lined with sterile white and gray, and the tension in the air was palpable. I had my lawyer, Thomas, at my side, and together we stood before the judge, ready to make our case. Greg was sitting across from me, his face unreadable, as though he had nothing to lose. His lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man, leaned in close to him, whispering words of encouragement. It was clear that Greg wasn't taking this seriously. He thought he could wriggle out of it, as he always had in the past. But today was different. This time, I wasn't backing down. As the trial proceeded, I found myself focusing less on Greg and more on the sense of empowerment that filled me. I wasn't the broken woman I had been when I first discovered the betrayal. I was strong, determined, and resolute. The hours spent in the courtroom were intense, but I was ready. The evidence was clear. The security footage of Greg taking the diamond, the financial records that tracked the sale of stolen goods, and my testimony, which painted a picture of how his deceit had unraveled my life. Thomas spoke with confidence and clarity, laying out the case in a way that left no room for doubt. Greg's lawyer tried to deflect, throwing out weak arguments and questioning my character, but nothing could change the facts. The truth was laid bare for everyone to see. Greg had stolen from me, and no amount of manipulation could erase that. The most difficult part of the entire ordeal wasn't the legal back and forth or the strategy. It was the emotional weight of seeing Greg, sitting there as if he hadn't done anything wrong. Every word he spoke, every denial, felt like a slap in the face. But I refused to show weakness. I was no longer the person who would let him gaslight me or manipulate the situation to his advantage. I was standing up for myself, and nothing was going to stop me now. The final moments of the trial were the hardest to endure. The judge was deliberate in his questions, asking both sides to present their closing statements. Greg's lawyer tried to paint him as a man who had simply made a mistake, who had been going through a rough time and acted impulsively. It was hard to even listen to the words. Greg had known exactly what he was doing. This wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated theft. And he had done it with no remorse, with no care for the consequences. Then it was my turn. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I spoke slowly but with conviction, recounting everything that had happened, from the moment I woke up in the hospital to the betrayal I had uncovered. I explained how Greg had used my vulnerability to steal the most precious thing I had left, the family diamond. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I simply told the truth, and in doing so, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. This was my moment of power, my moment of truth. After what felt like an eternity, the judge called for a recess. I sat there, my hands trembling, waiting for the final decision. When we returned, the judge took a moment to review everything, and then he spoke. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff," he said. "The defendant is found guilty of theft, fraud, and emotional distress. The defendant will serve a sentence of 27 years in prison." It took a moment for the words to fully sink in. 27 years. The man who had stolen from me, who had manipulated me for so long, would finally pay the price. For a second, I just sat there, frozen. Then, as the reality of it all hit me, I felt a rush of emotions, relief, satisfaction, vindication. It was over. Greg had been held accountable, and the weight that had crushed me for so long was finally lifted. As the courtroom emptied out, I stood up, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. I wasn't walking out of there as a victim. I was walking out as someone who had fought for herself, who had taken back control of her life. The diamond was returned to me, and though it would never be the same as before, it symbolized more than just a family heirloom. It represented my strength, my courage, and my willingness to stand up for what was right. I walked out of that courtroom with my head held high. I had won, not just the legal battle, but the battle for my own dignity. Greg may have taken my diamond, but he couldn't take away my power, my sense of self-worth, or my future. That day, the court's victory wasn't just a legal one, it was a personal victory. And I knew, deep down, that it was only the beginning of the new life I was going to create for myself. A life where I was free from the past, free from Greg, and finally, free to live for me. Sitting on my new porch, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. The diamond was back, but more importantly, I was back to being me. No longer controlled by betrayal, I spent my days painting and surrounded by friends who cared. The weight of the past was finally lifting, and I was living for myself again. I had rebuilt my life, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace.